Next up is Giuliana Bertha. She's an experienced mediator, facilitator, dispute resolution trainer, and scholar. In her 25 years of experience as a mediator and facilitator, she's worked for federal, state, and local government, as well as consumer, community, grassroots, and public interest groups. She's designed and conducted a variety of collaborative and consensus multi-stakeholder dialogues, workshops, and scientific review processes designed to improve communications, develop group learning, integrate complex information, and provide input into state and federal plans or policies, and to develop recommendations or create agreement on plans and policies. Today, she's going to talk about local level enterprise. She's going to talk about stormwater management in Fairfax County, Virginia.
Thanks so much. So I trust that many of you live in communities that have stormwater problems. So this was a situation in a highly developed community in Fairfax County. The community is a watershed that's shaped like this. Over the years, there have been significant infill development, and as years went by, more and more stormwater flooding. At the bottom of the steeply terrain neighborhoods was a major street, 2 lanes with a turn lane in the middle or on the sides as neighborhoods came in and out. A ravine, which was deeply incised and very eroded, a culvert right next to the road that was underneath a rail-to-trail bike trail, and the culvert was a historic Civil War culvert. Yeah, I'm not really sure how culverts can be historic, but it was brick and it was from the Civil War. So, and then an easement on this side that the county had to maintain the stormwater in that easement. Over time, there were more and more floods, which significantly much more impact, to the point where there was one flood where the water rushed down, popped the lids off all of the storm infrastructure at the bottom, shot through the culvert so that it was an arc going over Shreve Road and then drilling into the bank on the other side, and then put so much debris into the end of the road that the road ended up with this big pile of dirt from all the erosion, which then further caused problems with traffic. Significantly, what made the county move is that the 4 homeowners who lived on Bayport, Venice Street, sued the county for not maintaining the stormwater in the easement. So the county did what normally they would do. They talked to the lawyer said, yes, you are liable for that. And they hired their engineering firm. The engineering firm walked around, looked at where the stormwater infrastructure was, where you could put more infrastructure, what the capability was of infrastructure, and came up with a plan, took the plan to the different federal agencies, because it was a rail-to-trail and historic easement, took it to the other different federal and county agencies that it needed to go to, got approval on the plan and how it was going to go, went to the homeowners, the 4 or 5 homeowners who had sued, and said, this is what we're going to do and this is how it will manage it, and then held a public meeting. They failed to realize that what the plan was recommending was to take the 5 last acres of trees in the neighborhood with a taking from the public recreation, from the private recreation area. So they would get rid of the pool, the tennis courts, and the clubhouse. And where Venice Street is on this side of the stream, the Recreation Association is on that side of the street. So the public meeting was a food fight. And they also failed to realize that they had a very well-known national activist who lived in the community, who got everybody organized and filed some Freedom of Information Acts and got to find out that there were more options than just a huge gigantic stormwater detention pond. So this sounds like the typical way these kinds of things are handled, and what the county realized was we need to do something different. So they hired me, and at the point where I came in, the folks said one thing that had happened was nobody any longer trusted the county to do engineering and to do scoping and analysis and coming up with good ideas. So the credibility of the Fairfax County Public Water Authority was very, and infrastructure was affected. Second, the staff in the public agency felt kind of dismissed and disrespected. We kind of had some good ideas. We had some interesting ideas that were going to be implemented, and nobody has listened to us, and nobody's paid attention. So they were kind of bummed and didn't really feel like their job was so interesting anymore. The idea of stormwater detention ponds was now off the menu for anywhere in the Fairfax County. Nowhere was anybody going to like a stormwater detention pond, even when it was the only solution. So moratorium actually on stormwater detention ponds. And people in the communities felt like you pitted Falls Hills against Poplar Heights. Before, we were just two neighborhoods in this similar watershed, but now you made us bear the cost of this, and now you've pitted us against each other. And finally, people felt like, again, the public agency hasn't paid attention to us and has just rammed something down our throats. So it had more than just an impact on handling that water problem. So what went wrong? First, nobody asked the people, what is the problem? Is it the Venice homeowners, or is it a watershed, sub-watershed problem? Is it a stormwater problem in a particular kind of stormwater? Fast rate, large flow, or large flow over a long period of time? Is it a winter flood? So nobody asked anything like that. They also wanted to know, who is this engineering firm, and what kind of information did they gather? Did they actually measure what rain fell where when, or did they just use some model that we don't know much about? They also wanted to know, how did people analyze all those different options? Did they use criteria? How is it that cutting down all the trees is the right option? Because people intuitively felt like, don't trees help with stormwater? Wouldn't they slow things down? Why would that help? Wouldn't that just make things worse? So they didn't quite understand that. And finally, they wanted to know, how is it that this became the thing to do instead of presenting a range of options that we could sort of vote on, or et cetera? So what we did was, to answer those problems, was we brought people together in a big meeting called Community Water Stories. And people had to bring information about how much water fell what day. Pictures were great if they could show us, you know, my driveway actually had this much water at 5, and then, oh my gosh, this much at 6. We also wanted to know stories about people who lived there for a while. When they were kids, how deep was the stream? Could they walk across it, or did they have to step down in it? We geocoded all of that information into a layer on the county's map, and then correlated it with storm data. So we had much, much better flow data now from the neighborhood. We also constructed a technical working group, a negotiation group, and a general public involvement group. The technical working group conducted joint fact-finding. At the behest of the negotiating group, they asked a series of questions about, what's the problem? Where, you know, is it this way or this way? Is it related to flow? So they asked technical questions about what the problem is. Then they asked questions about, what kind of data do we need to know? How fast? Where is it? How much does the infrastructure hold? Then they asked questions about, what are all the different kind of options? Tell us what the options are and how many CFS of water it actually helps. Then they gave them different pros and cons of all the different options. Technical working group was actually, we put out a scope of work for the technical working group and for the engineering firm that worked with the technical working group. And the scope of work was written by the negotiating group. And they interviewed the engineers so that they could hire the people they wanted. We also had a lot of field trips. We walked around and looked at things. And looked at culverts, looked at other stormwater detention ponds. We looked at people's houses that had a lot of trees and not many. All kinds of whatever we could do to walk around and look at things. we constructed as many pictures and graphics and maps and charts so that people who learned by looking at a thing, looking at a picture, looking at a matrix, there are lots of different ways to understand the information. Finally, the negotiating group came up with a criteria matrix with weighted criteria that they used to analyze options. And they would take each option and put it in the criteria matrix and say, we knew what the number was at the bottom of the ravine, how many cubic foot per second of stormwater we needed to handle. They'd put it in that little box and say, oh shoot, that only handles 20%. Okay, so we like that, we'll add another one. Now we're at 30. Let's add that and that. So they could array the different options in the criteria matrix until they came up with a package of options that included low impact development kinds of fixes that were high up in the watershed, little things all over, and a list of things that were more stormwater infrastructure and heavier construction. That then went to the County Board of Supervisors, who unanimously chose it and then implemented it.
Is Barbara Sharp. Barbara's background is in communication and media, having worked as a journalist, press secretary, state and federal government ministers, that's health, agriculture, primary industry and energy portfolios in Australia, and for the past 18 years as a consultant in stakeholder engagement and issues management. As managing director of Pax Populus, Barbara is responsible for managing the overall business and leading stakeholder engagement practice. She's highly experienced in crisis communications and issues management and is advised on numerous sensitive and contentious issues involving high level of social conflict and reputational risks across the Asia-Pacific region. Today she's going to talk about a possible application of JFF to fugitive emissions and coal seam gas.
Thank you, Kim. I actually have never had a chance to do a JFF, and so what I'm going to talk to you about is actually fantasy, because it is a really powerful tool, and my story is about what the problem it could solve and where I think that JFF could be really powerful. The story in Australia happened when a farmer in a community of Tara, I think in central Queensland, was walking through his property one day and he came across a creek that's on a stream that's on his property. Creek is an Australian term for stream. You do call it a stream. And he noticed at this crossing that he normally went through that there were these bubbles emanating in the water, and he didn't know why. What he did know is that there was a company up the road, a gas company, who had machinery and was drilling down and was drilling for the gases that come out of coal seam gas. In fact, I think America gave us the term fracking, which has been used and misused and colourfully used in Australia equally well. So there is a coal seam gas industry that is burgeoning in Australia, so much so we're exporting it because we're good at exporting these sorts of things, to the extent where there's actually expected to be a lack of supply for domestic purposes. It's big. So this example of a farmer coming across bubbles emanating where they wouldn't have been, and the fugitive emissions is I don't know, you probably do know better than me, the process of coal seam gas, where they drill into the coal seam bed and they push the gases out, capture them, and you've got your coal seam gas. What this spurred was a whole lot of debate about emissions that escape from this process. So this farmer in Tara suddenly was writ large for all of these licences all over Queensland and New South Wales, where mostly farming land, but communities who are living in this area, and now they have this fear. Is it fugitive emissions? Is methane coming out of the ground? Is it coming out of water and streams through the aquifer that they drink through? This experience in Tara was then potentially in every coal seam gas mined community in Australia. So in this, who cares about this? Quite obviously, it's the individuals who are licensed the operators to extract the gas on their properties as the communities around them. It's the advocates for these communities who are opposing coal seam gas and invoke the precautionary principle, we should be doing this until we know whether there are fugitive emissions, whether those emissions, and it's methane, whether those emissions are dangerous. So you've got the farming community, you've got the individuals in the geography, you've got the environment groups, and there was an environment group that actually came to me about this issue. They are a science-based environment group, and they're an international, it was Worldwide Fund for Nature. They're an international organisation, and the thing with coal seam gas is that as it had been described as a transition energy, and our economy is based on coal and brown coal power, and we export a lot of it to particularly developing nations. So our economy is very largely driven by a really dirty coal. And coal seam gas was the opportunity for a transition energy. What WWF was thinking, well, we support transition energies because it's better than, at least we're getting away from coal, and it's going to be a long time before, at least in Australia, even longer now, that we're going to have wind and solar and all sorts of other options. But the notion of fugitive emissions was very difficult for this organisation, should they be endorsing it or not. What's more, they had ethical investment companies coming to them asking them, is this okay? Should we be recommending this to our customers as to whether they should buy into the gas companies, who of course were being targeted by the environment groups, the farming groups, the other environmental organisations? They had a stake in it too. And all of these people are the ones who cared. So there was a lot of people who could really do with the answer to the questions, are there fugitive emissions or not? Sorry, one piece that I forgot to add. There was a government study that had said that the level of emissions was 0.02%, but then another consultant study came out and said it was actually 7%. Now that's a big gap. So in this issue, where JFF could be really powerful is in finding out, shining a light on whether there is a gap and how difficult, how dangerous, what this gap means. And it hasn't happened for different reasons. It was very much a case of science being daggers at dawn. It was, our science is better than yours. They attacked consultants who had provided the science. It was gloves off. It was very nasty and brutal, and continues to be, except that, excuse me, as a result, some states have applied a moratorium on coal seam gas because they don't want this debate, and that just means it's a bit like gas. It's being pushed underground instead, and there is no resolution. So, in this, JFF can help enormously. If you can if you could compile a group that discussed what was important for them to know, they could recruit experts in the way that the process has been described, recruit the experts that everybody agrees are experts. And what they come back with, and the power of this process, is that if you agree on the process and you have a say in that process, then the outcome is agreed, it's shared, it's uncontestable. And for this, it can then contribute to decision making for farmers. You know, are they safe? Is it good? In a community, is methane an issue? Is it not? Should I be concerned? For policymakers, am I regulating? What the government needs to regulate this? What are they regulating? 0.2% emissions, 7%. Out of that, you can get peace of mind for those communities. You can get clarity. For the gas companies, for industry, they need most of all clarity. And while there's vagueness about this, they don't know whether they just need to know whether something's going to work for them or against them. It doesn't even matter if it works against them, so long as they know what the playing field is. And the uncertainty that existed while there is this contested science around this issue is really difficult for gas companies. For the Worldwide Fund for Nature, it meant it could mean that they could decide whether or not they actually supported coal seam gas or not. That was what they wanted answered. So what the JFF, the potential that the JFF could deliver in this is the ability for all of these people to make decisions one way or another, and it may even have even broader applications in the whole contested, the contest of beliefs that go alongside coal seam gas in Australia as well.
Finally, Keith Matson is president of his own planning firm, specializing in urban planning and policy analysis. His recent work is focused on implementing transit-oriented development along the future Hart Rapid Transit line. Prior to launching his consulting firm in November 2013, he worked here at UH for 17 years as a laboratory development project manager and economic development program director. His work here at UH included managing a National Institute of Health grant to build a new biological research lab, creating and administering new grant programs to support UH faculty research and teaching, and co-funding HighBeam, a public-private acceleration program for local technology startup companies. He's going to talk about the biohazard facility.
So I'm going to talk about a planning situation where, in hindsight, JFF could have made a major difference. And I think it's applicable to many other kinds of planning projects that occur not just in Hawaii but elsewhere. As Ken mentioned, it was the, you may recall, UH got a grant from the National Institutes of Health to build it's called a biosafety level 3 lab, which is a specialized lab to be able to do research on infectious diseases that could be airborne. So it's a very, very unique lab with a lot of very complex engineering. But as you can imagine, it's very, very difficult to cite these things because there's a lot of mystery about them. And I'll get into a little bit about that. The reason why I think this is an interesting case for other planning projects is because, as Peter mentioned in his intro, urban planning projects have several stages they go through that are required. You have environmental assessments, you have zoning approvals, you may have development agreements like HCDA administers, you may have special management area types of things, and certainly you have public outreach. And all of them are designed to talk about a project in detail, to disclose information about it, to have dialogue and input from the public. But I think we've all seen where those don't always cut it. In other words, in a very, very complex, controversial project, they're not always satisfactory in terms of really resolving questions and issues. And quite often can lead to a project either being approved when maybe people felt it shouldn't have been, or to a project's demise when maybe it shouldn't have been. So this works both ways. You know, communities can feel like this was crammed down our throats. Sure, they went through all the right stages, but you know, this just didn't pass the smell test. On the other hand, somebody who's building something can feel like, you know, we did everything honestly, and this process was hijacked, either by the media or by somebody who had political intentions that didn't really have to do with maybe the project you were doing, but certainly met their needs. So I look at JFF as whether or not that can make a difference in those kinds of cases. Now, with the Biosafety Level 3 lab, this project was originally intended to be in Kaka'ako, and then it was moved because we didn't get funding released during the fiscal crisis. It was then moved to Kalailoa, and the idea being that this is a fairly wide open area, not too much development around there. Maybe this is a good spot for it. And so we went through all the necessary parts of planning this thing. Our environmental assessment was very well done and went through and was approved and was never contested. However, we kept on running into, I guess, misunderstandings about the risk associated with the Biosafety Level 3 lab. And, you know, admittedly, these are not garden variety projects. If somebody is going to tell you, we're going to put a lab in your community, it's going to have a big fence around it, it's going to study diseases that may be lethal, but don't worry. It doesn't just, you know, happen. And people often come to their understandings of how infectious diseases spread through movies like Contagion and Outbreak. And, admittedly, even if Hollywood is trying to do a good job, if you have to start a pandemic, let it run its course, and resolve it in 2 hours, you're going to take some shortcuts. So people come away with this factual knowledge that is not really quite accurate. And so you find yourself, in that kind of situation, really trying to wrestle with how to demystify the science, be totally honest about it, but at the same time raise people's comfort level and understanding of, in this case, how do infectious diseases actually spread and how don't they? And we did a number of things to try to do that. We brought people through tours of the labs that already exist in Hawaii, conversations with scientists, many other things. But it's a tough road to hoe when you have that kind of challenge. So I'm just going to wrap it up because I think most people locally know that the lab ultimately wasn't funded, and it was really because we couldn't actually execute a lease agreement with the Department of Defense for the property, and we just ran out of time. But I think long term it would have been difficult to get full, acceptance and comfort with that laboratory in any community. Even though I can point to places around the country where they exist, and they exist next to schools, they exist next to child care centers, and there's never been an issue. But with respect to JFF and where it belongs possibly in planning projects of this type, and there are many others that you can imagine yourselves, personally I think early, before notions are very hard and fast in people's minds. And the chance you have to reach key stakeholders early in a process, certainly before the environmental assessment, is a chance to have spokespeople in the very community you're dealing with that can basically back you up or help explain, maybe not advocate outright, but certainly be giving the community a measure of confidence that what you're being told and what you're being told about actually has, some, validity and credibility to it because they've seen it up even closer. Maybe they took a tour of the lab. Maybe they've had an in-depth conversation with the scientists. But I would recommend it very, very early on before anything gets started. And particularly in a small community like Hawaii, where you're not going to have a lot of familiarity with very unique projects, certainly coming from the university where these are very complex scientific endeavors, and it's just a sort of a shock to the community to just try and absorb that much detail in that short time.
Thanks, Keith. We asked the panelists to be concise, and they've been exceedingly conscientious.